In front of his entire family, Terrence threw his wife out of the ICU with his mistress by his side. Hours later, they gathered again. Same hospital, different silence. His wife entered calmly, no longer a patient, no longer powerless. They had humiliated the woman who had saved them all. The night it all started, Terrence collapsed at a family dinner. One moment he was laughing, cutting into his steak, talking loud about some deal he was closing at the hospital where he worked. The next moment his fork clattered against the plate, his hand went to his chest, and his eyes went wide with fear. His wife Gabrielle was on her feet before anyone else moved. She was always like that, always watching, always ready to catch him before he fell. She screamed for someone to call 911 while she loosened his collar, checked his pulse, kept him breathing. She rode in the ambulance with him, holding his hand so tight. Her knuckles went white, whispering prayers under her breath that only God could hear. At County General Hospital, the doctors ran tests, did scans, spoke in that clinical voice that makes everything sound both urgent and distant at the same time. Terrence needed surgery immediately. His heart was failing. The blockage was severe. Without intervention, he had maybe 48 hours. The cost hit Gabrielle like a second heart attack, $250,000. Their insurance would cover some of it, but not enough, not nearly enough. The billing coordinator stood there with her clipboard, apologetic but firm, explaining payment plans and options, and all the bureaucratic language that really just meant one thing: no money, no surgery. Gabrielle stepped into the hallway. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone. She made a call that lasted less than 5 minutes. Her voice was steady, controlled, giving instructions to someone on the other end. When she came back, she told the coordinator she'd handle it. Within the hour, the surgery was approved. The nurses whispered among themselves about an anonymous donor who'd covered the entire cost. They wondered who would do such a thing, who had that kind of money just sitting around ready to save a stranger. But Gabrielle didn't say a word. She just sat in the waiting room, her grandmother's silver pendant hanging around her neck, waiting for them to tell her if her husband would live or die. Terrence survived the surgery. For 2 weeks, he lay in that ICU bed, recovering while machines beeped and tubes ran in and out of his body. Gabrielle was there every single day. She brought him homemade soup, the kind his mother used to make before she decided Gabrielle wasn't good enough to learn the family recipes. She read to him when he was awake, sat in silence when he needed to rest, adjusted his pillows, moistened his lips, did all the small invisible things that wives do when they love their husbands. The nurses knew her by name. They told her she was a good woman, that Terrence was lucky to have her. Gabrielle just smiled, tired and worn, and said she was doing what any wife would do. But when Terrence's family started showing up, the atmosphere changed. His mother Loretta arrived first, sweeping into the ICU like she owned the place, her perfume announcing her presence before she even entered the room. She barely glanced at Gabrielle before focusing all her attention on her son. Behind her came Charlene, Terrence's sister, with her designer handbag and her judgmental eyes that scanned Gabrielle from head to toe and found her lacking. Kenneth, the younger brother, followed with his hands in his pockets, uncomfortable but complicit in his silence. They formed a circle around Terrence's bed, and somehow Gabrielle found herself on the outside of it, pressed against the wall, invisible. Loretta's voice dripped with false sweetness when she finally acknowledged Gabrielle's existence. "If you were taking better care of my son, he wouldn't be stressed enough to have a heart attack," she said, not quite looking at Gabrielle, speaking to the air beside her head. Charlene made a sound that might have been agreement. Kenneth said nothing, but his silence was its own kind of violence. Gabrielle absorbed it all. She'd learned years ago that defending herself to this family was pointless. They'd decided who she was the day Terrence brought her home, and nothing she did would ever change their minds. So she stayed quiet, small, making herself even more invisible, hoping that if she took up less space, they might hurt her less. Then Simone walked in. She entered that ICU like she was walking onto a stage, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. Designer bag swinging from her shoulder, expensive perfume filling the small space, high heels clicking against the hospital floor in a rhythm that said she belonged there more than anyone else. She walked straight to Terrence's bedside and kissed him on the forehead, a gesture so intimate and possessive that Gabrielle felt something crack inside her chest. It wasn't her heart breaking, that had been breaking slowly for years. It was something deeper, something that had been holding her together finally giving way. Simone turned to face the family, and they received her like she was one of them. Loretta smiled. Charlene moved aside to make room. Kenneth nodded in acknowledgement. "I'm so glad I could be here for Terrence during this difficult time," Simone said, and the way she said it made it clear that she was the one who belonged there, not the legal wife standing in the corner, trying to remember how to breathe. When Terrence finally woke up fully, his eyes adjusted to the light, took in the scene, and registered both women. Gabrielle on one side, Simone on the other. For a moment, something flickered across his face, something that might have been shame or guilt or awareness of how wrong this was. But then his mother spoke, and whatever human feeling had almost surfaced in him drowned again under the weight of his family's expectations. "Terrence, baby, you don't need this stress," Loretta said, her voice sugary and poisonous at the same time. "Tell her to leave." Terrence looked at Gabrielle. His eyes were cold, empty, like looking at a stranger instead of the woman who'd been by his bedside for 2 weeks, the woman who'd ridden in the ambulance holding his hand, the woman who'd somehow made sure his surgery happened when they had no way to pay for it. "You heard her," he said, his voice flat and final. "Leave." Gabrielle's voice shook when she spoke. "I'm your wife." Simone laughed. It was a cruel sound, sharp and cutting, designed to humiliate. "Wife? Girl, he hasn't loved you in years. You're just a burden." Someone called security. Gabrielle would never forget that part, how casually they did it, like she was a problem to be removed, rather than a person who'd given everything she had to the man lying in that bed. 2 security guards arrived, polite but firm, and escorted her out of the ICU. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she didn't beg, she just walked, 1 foot in front of the other, through the hallway she'd walked 1,000 times, bringing her husband soup and hope. Behind her she could hear them laughing. Terrence, his family, Simone, all of them laughing like her humiliation was the funniest thing they'd ever witnessed. As Gabrielle reached the exit, she glanced back one last time. She saw them all together, a united front against her, celebrating her removal like they'd won something. What they couldn't see was the man watching from the second-floor office window. Mr. Calloway, the hospital director, stood there with his arms crossed, shaking his head slowly. He'd been with County General for 30 years, and he knew things that other people didn't know. He knew who really owned this hospital. He knew who'd saved it from bankruptcy. He knew who'd paid for Terrence Walker's surgery. And as he watched them humiliate Gabrielle, he whispered to himself, "They have no idea." To understand what happened next, you have to understand where Gabrielle came from. She grew up in a small town in rural Georgia The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and poverty wasn't shameful because everyone was poor together. Her parents died in a car accident when she was 7 years old, and she went to live with her grandmother, Miss Eunice. That woman raised Gabrielle on love and lessons, teaching her that kindness was the most valuable currency a person could carry. "You may not have money, baby," Miss Eunice used to say, while they sat on the porch shelling peas, "but you always have your heart. Don't ever let anyone convince you that kindness is weakness." Gabrielle was brilliant in school. She had a mind that absorbed information like a sponge and a work ethic that came from watching her grandmother clean houses for white families who treated her like she was invisible. Teachers told Gabrielle she could be anything she wanted, and she believed them. She earned a full scholarship to nursing school, graduated at the top of her class, and took a job at County General Hospital in the city, far from the dirt roads and broken dreams of her childhood. Before Miss Eunice died, she gave Gabrielle a silver pendant shaped like a key. They were sitting in the hospital room where her grandmother had spent her last weeks, and Miss Eunice's hands were so thin Gabrielle could see every bone, every vein, every mark that time and hard work had left behind. "This key reminds you that you hold the power to unlock your own future," Miss Eunice said, her voice weak but steady. "Don't ever let anyone take that from you, you hear me?" Gabrielle wore that pendant every single day. It hung around her neck like a promise, like a piece of her grandmother's strength transferred into silver. What nobody knew, what Gabrielle never told anyone, was what happened after Miss Eunice died. There was a letter in the safety deposit box, written in her grandmother's careful handwriting, and a key that unlocked decades of family history. Miss Eunice's family had owned land back before Jim Crow tried to steal everything black people had. That land had been passed down, fought over, nearly lost a dozen times, but somehow it survived. When the city expanded and developers came calling, that worthless country land suddenly became prime real estate. Miss Eunice had been smart, patient, and ruthless in ways that would have surprised anyone who knew her as just a sweet old church lady. She'd negotiated, fought, and held out until the price was right. The settlement that came to Gabrielle after all the legal paperwork was sorted out was $12 million. Gabrielle never told Terrence. She met him at County General, where he worked in hospital administration, and he pursued her with the kind of attention that made her feel seen for the first time since her grandmother died. He was charming, ambitious, full of plans and dreams that he shared with her over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. They married within a year, and at first it was good. He respected her, loved her, treated her like she mattered. But as his career grew, as he climbed higher in the hospital's administrative structure, something changed. He started to see her as less. The nurse wife became an embarrassment. The woman from the country became something to hide from his colleagues and family. His love didn't disappear all at once. It leaked out slowly over the years until one day, Gabrielle looked up and realized the man she'd married was gone, replaced by someone who barely remembered why he'd loved her in the first place. But Gabrielle's money grew. She invested quietly, carefully, following advice from financial advisors who taught her how to turn $12 million into something that could change generations. She bought shares in struggling hospitals, invested in real estate, built a portfolio that would have shocked anyone who thought she was just a simple nurse living off her husband's salary. One of those struggling hospitals she invested in was County General. Over 3 years, she bought enough shares to become the majority owner, 62%. She owned the building where her husband worked, the ICU where he'd just thrown her out, the very walls that had witnessed her humiliation, and she never said a word. She funded Terrence's business ventures when they failed. She paid off his debts when his schemes didn't work out the way he had planned. She covered family emergencies, sent money to Loretta when the rent was short, helped Kenneth with his legal fees, paid for Charlene's daughter's private school tuition. She did it all anonymously, through accounts and trusts and intermediaries, watching her husband take credit for generosity that came from her pocket. She stayed because she loved him. She stayed because Miss Eunice had taught her that marriage was a covenant, not a contract. She stayed because leaving felt like admitting defeat. But every person has a breaking point, and Gabrielle was about to reach hers. After they threw her out of the ICU, Gabrielle moved into a small apartment across town. Terrence filed for divorce within days. The papers arrived with no explanation, no attempt at reconciliation, just legal language that essentially said, "Get out of my life and take nothing with you." His lawyer made it clear Terrence wanted a clean break. No alimony, no settlement, just gone. His family celebrated like they'd won the lottery. Loretta called Gabrielle just to tell her she'd never been good enough for Terrence, that they were all glad she was finally out of the picture. Charlene sent a text message that was supposed to sound sympathetic, but really just twisted the knife deeper. Kenneth didn't reach out at all, and somehow his silence hurt more than the other's cruelty. Simone posted photos on social media, her and Terrence together, smiling, looking happy, with captions about finally finding real love and new beginnings. Every photo was a weapon aimed at Gabrielle's heart, and the worst part was that people commented their congratulations, their happiness for Terrence, like he hadn't just abandoned his wife of 15 years for a woman who wouldn't have looked at him twice if he didn't have what he thought was money and status. Behind closed doors, the family was plotting. They met at Terrence's house, sitting around the dining table where Gabrielle used to serve them meals they never thanked her for. Loretta laid it out plainly. They needed to make sure Gabrielle didn't get a single penny. She was a gold digger from day one. Loretta said, even though Gabrielle had never asked Terrence for anything, had paid more bills than he ever knew about, had funded the lifestyle they all enjoyed. They hired a lawyer whose entire job was to ensure Gabrielle walked away from the marriage with nothing. Terrence signed every paper they put in front of him. "She gave me nothing," he told his family. "She deserves nothing." Simone whispered poison in his ear every night, feeding him lies about Gabrielle that he wanted to believe, because believing them made what he was doing feel justified. She told him Gabrielle had probably been cheating, that she'd never really loved him, that she'd only been at the hospital during his recovery to make herself look good. Terrence believed every word because it was easier than facing the truth about what he'd become. Gabrielle sat alone in her apartment, staring at Miss Eunice's pendant. For the first time since her grandmother died, she cried, not because she'd lost Terrence. She'd been losing him for years, one small cut at a time, until there was nothing left to bleed. She cried because she'd given everything to people who saw her as nothing. She'd funded their lives, supported their dreams, sacrificed her pride and dignity, trying to be enough for people who would never think she was enough. She took off the pendant, laid it on the table, and whispered, "I tried, Grandma, I tried." The call came 2 days later. Her financial advisor's voice was professional, routine, like he was calling about a dentist appointment instead of something that would change everything. "Mrs. Gabrielle, the board meeting is in 2 weeks. County General's performance review. As the majority shareholder, your presence is required." Something shifted in Gabrielle when she heard those words. She'd been invisible for so long, making herself smaller and quieter, trying to take up less space so people would hurt her less. But invisibility hadn't protected her. Kindness hadn't saved her. Sacrifice hadn't earned her respect. She was done being small. She made appointments, hair, nails, wardrobe. She spent money on herself for the first time in years, not out of vanity, but out of recognition that she needed armor for what was coming. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This woman had sharp eyes and a straight spine and an expression that said she was done apologizing for existing. 2 weeks later, County General Hospital hosted a special recognition ceremony. It was a big deal, the kind of event where local politicians showed up to shake hands and take photos, where donors got their names on plaques, where the hospital administration celebrated its own importance. Terrence was being honored for his years of service, receiving an award that came with a nice plaque and a round of applause and a sense that he'd accomplished something meaningful. His family filled the front row. Loretta wore her church hat like it was a crown. Charlene had her phone out, ready to document every moment for social media. Kenneth sat quietly, uncomfortable in his suit, but present nonetheless. And Simone sat beside Terrence, her hand on his arm, playing the role of the proud girlfriend who'd stood by her man. The conference hall was packed. Hospital staff filled the seats, some genuinely happy for Terrence, others just there because attendance was expected. Board members sat at a special table near the front, looking official and important. Donors clustered together, the wealthy benefactors who kept the hospital running through their tax-deductible generosity. The energy in the room was celebratory, light, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Mr. Calloway took the stage. He was a tall man with gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He'd been the hospital director for 30 years, had seen administrations come and go, had navigated budget crises and Medicare cuts, and all the challenges that came with trying to keep a public hospital alive in a system that didn't value public health. He stood at the podium, adjusted the microphone, and smiled at the crowd. "Before we honor Mr. Terrence Walker for his service," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "I have an important announcement. 3 years ago, this hospital was on the brink of bankruptcy. We were 60 days from closing our doors, from turning away patients, from putting hundreds of people out of work. An anonymous donor stepped forward and saved us. That donor not only provided the financial resources we needed, but also became our majority shareholder, investing in our future, believing in our mission. Today, that donor has agreed to reveal her identity." The room went silent. Every eye turned toward the doors at the back of the hall, waiting to see who had that kind of money and that kind of heart. The doors opened, and Gabrielle walked in. She didn't look like the woman who'd been thrown out of the ICU 3 weeks ago. She didn't look like the quiet wife who'd absorbed abuse with bowed head and silent tears. She wore a tailored navy suit that fit her like it had been made for her body specifically because it had. Her hair was pulled back, elegant and simple, revealing a face that had always been beautiful but was now also powerful. Miss Eunice's pendant hung around her neck, catching the light, reminding her where she came from and why she was here. She walked down the center aisle with measured steps, unhurried, unbothered, owning every inch of space she moved through. Terrence's face lost all its color. Simone's mouth fell open. Loretta grabbed Charlene's arm hard enough to bruise. Kenneth just stared, his mind trying to make sense of what his eyes were seeing. Mr. Calloway continued, his voice warm with genuine respect. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet Mrs. Gabrielle Walker, majority shareholder of County General Hospital, the woman who saved this facility when no one else would, the anonymous donor who personally funded the cardiac wing, the ICU renovations, and yes, the woman who donated $250,000 to fund Mr. Terrence Walker's emergency heart surgery." The room exploded in whispers. People turned to each other, seeking confirmation that they'd heard correctly. Board members nodded because they'd known. The financial team had known. But everyone else was learning for the first time that the quiet nurse who used to work here, the woman who'd been humiliated and thrown out, actually owned the entire building. Gabrielle reached the stage. Mr. Calloway stepped aside, offering her the microphone with a small nod that said he was proud of her. She took it, looked out at the crowd, and let the silence build until every person in that room was holding their breath, waiting for her to speak. "I didn't come here for applause," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I came here for clarity. 3 weeks ago, I was thrown out of this hospital's ICU by my husband, in front of his family with his mistress by his side. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The only sound was Gabrielle's voice filling the space with truth that couldn't be denied or explained away. What they didn't know is that I own 62% of this hospital. I funded the cardiac wing. I paid for the ICU equipment. I anonymously donated the medical technology that saved my husband's life. And yes, I personally provided the $250,000 that paid for his surgery when his insurance wouldn't cover it." Terrence tried to stand. His legs wouldn't cooperate. Simone had gone completely still, her face frozen in an expression of dawning horror. "I did it because I loved him," Gabrielle said, and for the first time her voice carried emotion, not anger, but something sadder, something that spoke to all the years of trying and failing and trying again. "But love without respect is charity, and I'm done being charitable." She turned to look directly at Terrence. "You called me worthless. Your mother said I was a burden. Your mistress said I gave you nothing." She paused, letting each word land like a stone. "I gave you everything, your life, your dignity, your second chance, and you threw me away like trash." Simone opened her mouth to speak. Gabrielle held up one hand, and the gesture was so commanding that Simone actually closed her mouth again. "No," Gabrielle said. "You don't get to talk, you get to listen." She shifted her attention to the family in the front row. "You celebrated my humiliation in the same building I built. You laughed at my pain in the same ICU I funded. You threw me out of the hospital I own. Karma doesn't need me. You're standing in it." Mr. Calloway stepped forward, his face professionally neutral, but his eyes showing something like satisfaction. "Effective immediately, Mr. Terrence Walker's employment with County General Hospital is terminated. Security will escort him and his guests from the premises." Terrence's voice cracked when he finally found it. "Gabrielle, please." She didn't look at him. She was done looking at him, done hoping he'd see her, done waiting for him to become the man she'd needed him to be. "You wanted me out of your life," she said. "Congratulations. You got your wish." Then she turned and walked off the stage, leaving Terrence and his family and Simone sitting in the wreckage of their own cruelty. The month that followed was a masterclass in consequences. Terrence lost everything. His job was gone, and his reputation went with it. No hospital in the state would hire him after word spread about what he'd done. The man who'd thrown his wife out of the ICU was the same man whose life she'd saved, whose career she'd funded, whose entire existence had been built on her silent sacrifice. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. Medical bills started arriving. Turns out that when you humiliate the woman who paid for your surgery, you still owe money for your recovery. Collections agencies called daily. His house, the one he'd been so proud of, went into foreclosure. He called Gabrielle dozens of times, leaving voicemails that went from angry to pleading to desperate. She never answered. She'd said everything she needed to say. Simone disappeared the second Terrence's money dried up. She blocked his number, deleted every photo, erased herself from his life like she'd never been there at all. Terrence sat in his empty house, surrounded by boxes, waiting for the bank to force him out, and finally understood what Gabrielle had known for years. Simone never loved him. She loved what she thought he had, and what he had came from the woman he'd thrown away. His family tried to reach out to Gabrielle. Loretta called first, her voice sugary and false, begging Gabrielle to reconsider, to help Terrence, to remember that he was her son and she loved him. "Please, Gabrielle," she said. "Terrence is suffering. He's my son." Gabrielle's response was quiet and final. "And I was his wife. Where were you when he threw me out?" Loretta had no answer. She hung up and never called again. Charlene sent a long text message full of apologies that came too late to mean anything. Kenneth showed up at Gabrielle's office building and security turned him away. Before he made it past the lobby, they'd humiliated her publicly, celebrated her pain like it was entertainment. She didn't owe them private forgiveness. Terrence made one final attempt. He showed up at Gabrielle's office in the middle of a Tuesday, pushing past the receptionist, demanding to see his wife. Security stopped him in the lobby. He shouted from there, his voice echoing off the marble floors, desperate and broken. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please." Gabrielle heard him from her office on the 15th floor. She walked to the window and looked down, saw him being escorted out by security while people on the street stopped to watch the scene. She felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even pity, just peace. She'd spent so many years feeling everything about him, carrying his emotions along with her own, and now she felt nothing at all. She turned away from the window and went back to work. 6 months later, Gabrielle stood in front of a newly built community health center in rural Georgia, in the town where she'd been raised by her grandmother. The building was beautiful, modern but warm, designed to serve the people who couldn't afford to travel to the city for health care. The sign above the door read, "Miss Eunice Community Wellness Center." Local families gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, children playing in the grass, old folks sitting in folding chairs, everyone dressed in their church clothes to witness something good being born in their community. Gabrielle touched the pendant around her neck, the silver key that had hung there for so many years, and she whispered to her grandmother's memory, "I found the key, Grandma. It was never about them. It was always about me." She cut the ribbon with ceremonial scissors, and the crowd cheered, and for the first time in years, Gabrielle felt genuinely, completely happy. That evening, back in her city apartment, Gabrielle found a letter waiting for her. It was from Terrence, handwritten, thick with pages of words he'd probably labored over. She held it for a long moment, feeling its weight, knowing that inside was probably more apologies, more explanations, more attempts to make her understand why he'd done what he'd done. She didn't open it. She placed it in a drawer with other things from her past that no longer had power over her present. Maybe one day she'd read it. Maybe she wouldn't. It didn't matter anymore. His chapter in her life was closed. Gabrielle learned that silence is not weakness, sacrifice is not surrender, and walking away is not defeat. She gave everything to people who valued nothing, but in the end she learned the most important lesson of all. The only person who needs to see your worth is you. She'd spent years trying to prove herself to people who would never think she was enough. She'd made herself small, trying to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold her. She'd poured herself into a marriage that had been empty for years, hoping that if she just loved hard enough, sacrificed enough, gave enough, it would somehow be enough. But enough was never about what she gave. It was about what they were capable of receiving, and they were capable of nothing but taking. Now, Gabrielle walked through the world differently. She didn't make herself small anymore. She didn't apologize for existing. She didn't wait for permission to claim what was hers. She'd built an empire in silence, and when they tried to destroy her, she simply revealed what had been true all along. She was never the weak one in the story. She was never the victim. She was the one with the power. She just hadn't felt the need to prove it until they forced her hand. The pendant hung around her neck, catching the light from her apartment window. Outside, the city moved through its evening rhythm, millions of people living their lives, making their choices, writing their own stories. Gabrielle's story was still being written. This wasn't the end. It was just the end of the chapter where she let other people hold the pen. See you in the next story.